The app model is by far and away the biggest change for developers in SharePoint 2013. Unlike Farm and Sandbox solutions, it allows absolutely no custom server-side code to run inside of the SharePoint farm. One of the key goals of apps is that normal users should be able to deploy them just like they can with Sandbox solutions, and so they can be provisioned by users from an app catalog. Now, the application catalog can be centralized inside your organization, and or it can be outside of the organization in the SharePoint App Store. In either case, as the administrator of the farm, you have the ability to determine which apps are allowed and which ones are not. You can create an app with either Visual Studio or the Napa tools. And I should point out that before you can begin doing any app development, that additional setup is required. This is a screenshot of the Office Marketplace. So when you go to add an app, you can navigate to the Office Marketplace and pick from different apps that are available. And you will notice in this image that some of these are dimmed and others are lit up. And what this shows is that it's possible as the application developer to specify prerequisites that the site must meet in order for the application to be applicable. This is a screenshot of the internal application catalog for SharePoint. Now, one of the things that is really confusing to a lot of people when they start learning about apps is that there are a set of guidelines for apps that apply to Office 365 in the marketplace for approval. But there is also this ability to create a catalog both in SharePoint Online and locally to do what they call side installs. So there are a lot of things that apps can do that are not going to get you approval if you're trying to build a product for sale in the 365 marketplace, because they're very conservative. They don't want people to, from their store, buy something that may cause them some sort of problem or potentially be malicious and steal their data. But there's nothing to prevent you as the administrator from buying an application or building an application from somebody and then installing it into a catalog yourself for your Office 365 tenant or for your local on-premises SharePoint farm. In those cases, you have available to you the complete range of all the possible things that an app could do. All right, so what we're going to do now is jump over to a SharePoint site, and we'll take a look at an app catalog, and then we will add an app. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is actually create an application catalog for this local farm. So I'm in Central Administration, and I'm going to go to Apps. And I've had to provision a few service applications for this. I use the configuration wizard to do so. The process is very well documented, but slightly tedious, so we're not going to go through all of that. Just know that if you just did a fresh SharePoint installation, there's some additional things that you need to do before you get to this point. But what I'm going to do is, under App Management, I'm going to go into Manage App Catalog. And at this point in time, I do not have an app catalog created for my web application, which is under SharePoint. So I'm going to choose OK, and we'll call this Demo Catalog. And we'll put this under Sites, Apps. And then, unlike the traditional create site collection screen, which is what this is, all the way down to here, we actually have the ability to specify groups of end users that should be able to see apps from the app catalog. Now, I'm just going to come in here and say all users, everyone. But you have the option of restricting this to a subset of your folks. And then I will choose OK. And this is actually going to create a new site collection. All right, here we go, and we can open this up and see that we can deploy apps for SharePoint, apps for Office. People can request apps, and this would be the first step of actually creating our own catalog. We would go into apps for SharePoint and apps for Office and add things that we either bought and or produced internally, and once we went to our SharePoint site, people could select from that catalog. So I'm going to open up my SharePoint team site and go to Site Contents and choose Add an App. And now I have this link that says From Your Organization, and it says there's nothing here yet because I haven't deployed any apps to my catalog. Now, with Visual Studio, I can deploy apps directly to a developer site for testing, which prevents me from having to go through the trouble of putting it into a catalog that would make it available to people when I'm not quite ready for that to happen yet. If I'm not using a store that I deployed locally or my own app catalog, I can always, assuming I'm allowing it, go out to the SharePoint store. And this is actually going out to the web. This is subject to permissions. But you can see that already there are lots of different apps that people are getting approval for to sell through the SharePoint store. So let's say we decided we wanted to take a look at the Nintex workflow preview. I could add this to my site. And when I do this, I get a warning that says that the Nintex preview requires the ability to create or delete document libraries and lists in the site, and that it needs to access basic information about the users of this site. And I can also see the privacy statement and terms and conditions. So it's up to me as the person who's doing the installation to decide, do I trust this vendor in this application or not before it will actually work. And I should also point out that if I don't have permission to create or delete document libraries, I can't install an app and give it permission to create or delete document libraries. All right, so I'll go ahead and click Trust It. The app model supports a variety of different architectures and topologies, and that makes it a little bit difficult to get your head around and discuss. But broadly speaking, there are two types of apps. The first one is cloud-hosted. And a cloud-hosted app can be auto-hosted, which means that the server-side logic and or the user interface is hosted in Azure. Or it can be provider-hosted, which means you provide the host and the authentication infrastructure, which means that even though we discuss this as a cloud-hosted app, it may not, in fact, be in the cloud. It may be on-premises. The second type of SharePoint app is called a SharePoint-hosted app. And in a SharePoint-hosted app, all the components are in SharePoint. And these are going to be in a special app web, which is a stripped-down version of a normal site just for apps in an isolated app domain. And the app can integrate with the host web's navigation via a type of feature called a custom action. Now, it is possible to have a hybrid app as well, where you have some functionality in one of the cloud-hosted models, perhaps remote event receivers, and have the user interface hosted inside of SharePoint, inside of an app web. So you can see that there are a lot of different choices here. And so just to review, we can put everything out in Azure, we can put everything in a provider-hosted app, we can put everything in SharePoint, or we can put some of the stuff in SharePoint and some of the stuff out in Azure or in our own hosted environment. So like I said, there's a special thing where our SharePoint hosted apps go called an app web, which means that there's also a thing called a host web. And the host web is the SharePoint site where the app is installed. So wherever you are when you click Add an App and go to the app catalog, that's going to be the host web. And the app web is an optional web for use by the app. Not all apps have to have app webs, many don't. But this is required in SharePoint hosted apps. It's also required if you create an Access Services app. A lot of times it just contains instructions and setup for an app that is otherwise cloud hosted. So a common strategy would be for an app web to get some help pages. The user will install the app, read the instructions, and then do whatever additional things that are necessary to configure the application for actual use. The thing about the app web that you need to understand is that it has very limited SharePoint functionality. It doesn't have a quick launch bar. It doesn't have top navigation. There's no site settings page. There's no ability to manage users and groups. There's no ability to activate or deactivate features through the user interface. It's very, very stripped down. However, it could be still potentially very complex custom functionality. For example, the Nintex workflow all runs inside of an app web, and it's all based on JavaScript and HTML. Now, there may be some server-side component there as well in terms of Azure or a private cloud. I don't know, but that's a good example of a really complicated app that is running inside of an app web. The thing is, it's up to you when you're in an app web, if you're going to use it for the entire app, to bring all of the navigation, all of the configurability, everything, because none of the stock SharePoint stuff is going to be available to you in the context of that app web. All right, so what we're going to do now is take a look at a SharePoint hosted app. In this demonstration, we're going to build a simple SharePoint hosted app. And we're going to deploy this hosted app to a special type of site collection called a developer site. And I created this previously in SharePoint Central Administration, but I'll go ahead and show you that on the Create Site Collections page, there is a type of site called developer site. And that's what this is. Developer sites are set up so that you can deploy directly from Visual Studio into the site to test your apps. Now, there's quite a bit of setup that you need to do to configure apps on a SharePoint farm for development. But the good news is that right off the developer site is a link to Microsoft that has all sorts of step-by-step instructions to take you through the basic steps of getting started building applications. All right, so I've already done all that stuff. This environment is nice and prepped and ready. And so what I'm going to do in Visual Studio is create a new project. And this is going to be an app for SharePoint 2013. So I'm going to call this app Sales List. And I'll click OK. And then right off the bat, I need to make some decisions. The first thing I need to do is tell it what site I'm going to deploy to. So this is our development site that we were just looking at. Or I could deploy to Office 365 as a developer site. And then I need to specify what I'm going to use to host my app. And in this case, we're going to create a SharePoint hosted app. And that means that this app is going to run strictly in the context of a SharePoint app web by default, and it won't have any server-side code. All right, so I'm going to click Finish to begin building my app. Okay, so Visual Studio makes my new project, and the project by default has got a couple of pages in it. One is the default page, which is going to display when the site opens up, and the other one is, well, I take that back. I'm going to create the other one here in just a second. All right, so we have a page called default ASPX, and it is linking to a script called app.js, and app.js is right here. And what this does is it just gets the username of the current user and displays it on the screen. So it's kind of pre-configured for you. These are deployed to an app web using features, just like if you were building a farm or a sandbox solution, although the packaging mechanism is a little different. And so the page is deployed via a module to a URL in our site called pages/default.aspx, and the scripts are all deployed into a folder called scripts. Then you'll notice that they've included the jQuery libraries along with IntelliSense support. So it's a pretty nice way to get started as far as it goes. And what I'm going to do now is just click Start and see what our page looks like before we do any additional development. So Visual Studio went through the process of doing all of the installation and then opened up the browser. If we come over here and look at the output window, oh, it clears it after the deployment is finished. But if the output window had been showing, we would have seen it go through all the steps of installing the app. So here's the app, and this is an app web. And so we have a URL. I specified this prefix as app. And then, well, let's just copy this to the clipboard and put it in Notepad to make it easier to read. All right, so I specified as part of the setup that my app domain was going to start with apps.doug.local, and that the prefix for the app was going to be app. And so it generates this magic number to create a unique URL for the app itself. And it is located off of sites dev, which is the site collection where I deployed the app. And if I were to look at the site collection in the object model, I would see that this web is in fact part of the host web's site collection. Sales list is the name of the app. And then pages default.aspx was the page that was deployed. And then the rest of this are all the common parameters that are passed in so that my app is able to actually function. If we come over to Visual Studio and look at the app manifest file, it has a designer, and what it specifies for the query string is this little token that says standard tokens. And this standard tokens is what causes the SPApp web URL, the product number, the language, the host URL, all the pieces of information that I would need if I needed to interact with the environment from this page come to me directly off of the query string. In the JavaScript, what's happening is that we are using the JavaScript object model when the document ready event fires through jQuery to get the current context and then to get the web. And then we call this getUsername function. So in getUsername, we call getCurrentUser, which is the current user property of the web class. And then we say context.loadUser. Now all of this stuff right up till here, or rather including this, takes place on the client, and we don't actually get anything from the server. This says that we're going to load from the server this user. And then we call execute query async. This sends a query to the server, to a client service, and it responds with the thing we asked it to load. And when it succeeds, then we use jQuery to update the element whose ID is message with the text hello and then the title of the user. So this also shows that when we're working with apps in SharePoint hosted model that we have a lot of additional learning to do with regards to this new JavaScript object model, and also if you're a typical SharePoint developer with regards to developing JavaScript as opposed to C#. And as you become more and more familiar with SharePoint 2013, you will quickly come to terms with the fact that if you don't know JavaScript, you need to learn JavaScript because it's going to be a standard skill that you're going to need to employ continuously. Now, one final thing that I want to look at here before we add some features to it is the app web itself. All right, so you'll notice when you look at this, let's open up. Well, I didn't mean to do that. All right, so let me open up in another browser so I don't confuse myself, our developer site. And we will dock this on the bottom of the screen. I'll try to move this to the bottom of the screen. We don't want this to ask again. All right, so if you'll notice, here we have only a browse ribbon. There's no page ribbon, although this is an ASPX page. You don't see share, follow, edit, sync. None of the SkyDrive Pro stuff is available to us. There's no gear to get us to the site settings page. So this is really, really stripped down. And this Hello Administrator, although it's appearing in the same spot on the page that the Quick Launch bar appears in the developer site, is actually the main body of the page. So it is possible in an app web to define a web template and deploy it, but even then, the app web is not going to have a lot of the out-of-the-box functionality that you would expect to find in a team site. So for that reason, my recommendation is if you're building a traditional SharePoint-style application business solution and you want to use an app model, is that the app should actually deploy and provision the pieces that you need onto your host web, and you should keep the app web use to a minimum. All right, so let's close this. And I have a completed version of this solution that I've already opened up. or that I've created previously. And so I'm going to navigate over to it and open it up. And while this is happening, we'll check out our site contents on the developer site. And you can see that when I closed the browser, Visual Studio retracted the other app for me. So it's not there anymore. All right. So this one, I have added a new list instance called sales data. Or rather, a new list template along with a list instance. And so this is going to create a list called sales data with the values, apples, televisions, and frogs, the different pricing, or rather the target sales and the actual sales that we were able to produce. And if I deploy this, you can see that the home page now has a list view web part on it that represents the sales data. And if I click on this, we do get ribbons to activate. So we can still have web part pages inside of an app web. If I open up the items ribbon or the list ribbon, however, you'll notice that there is functionality missing here. We don't have Connect to Outlook. There's no list settings tab. And so this just drives forward the point that I'm making, which is that there's a lot of functionality missing if you choose to go with an app web. The way this was deployed was our Pages module now has inside of the file element that deploys the default ASPX file the declaration of a list view that is put into a web part zone. I also added the web part zone into the page. But this illustrates that a lot of the traditional farm and sandbox-based techniques that you know will still work in app web. So although it is a stripped down piece of functionality, it's still pretty familiar, and a lot of the stuff works the same way that you would expect. For a lot of lightweight solutions, the fact that an app web is so lacking in features is not necessarily that big of a deal. If what your solution is going to represent is maybe one or two pages that are going to be used by the user, you can integrate that into the host web by using a special kind of web part called an app part. So an app part, when deployed, is going to appear in the host web in the web part gallery when a user goes to insert a web part into their page. And what it actually is this thing called a client web part that is defined inside of the SharePoint hosted app itself, or for that matter, a cloud hosted app. What happens when they add it is that an iframe is added to the host web that points to the app web's page, which represents the functionality that is contained inside the client web part. And this works with SharePoint hosted apps and cloud hosted apps and provider hosted apps. The thing about this is that it does require insertion of the app part into the host web page. So this is a good solution where you have, like I said, one or two pieces of functionality, and you can say to your user with a straight face, all right, once you've installed the app, I need you to edit a page and add the web part in. That's fine. If you had dozens of pieces of functionality, then this model would probably fall apart pretty quickly. Now, in order for the app part to be able to safely communicate with the host web and external web services, because there's an iframe there, the application model contains proxies that will allow you to talk to the host and also to talk to external web services that you declare ahead of time that your app part is going to need to be able to consume to keep everything nice and secure. All right, so let's jump over to the sales list app, and I will show you an app part in action. Okay, so here we are in our SharePoint hosted app, and I have a page called salesview.aspx. And this is a page that contains JavaScript object model code along with Microsoft Ajax code and jQuery that allows us to run a query against the sales data list and then present that to the user so they can see it. So let me just hide the Solution Explorer in the Properties window so we can examine this. Now, some of this JavaScript comes in as part of the template itself that Visual Studio provides when you go to create an app part. The template as it currently exists is a little bit broken. The declaration to include Ajax is not there, and so if you go to do this, you're going to need to know that. One way that you can do a sanity check against this is to also use Napa, which does not have that problem. But the custom code that I wrote is down here inside this second script block. And what we have here is a block of code that defines a context and a string. And this string is XML, which represents a view, a camel view. And camel views are what are used in the client-side object model and the JavaScript object model to execute queries against the server. And so what this says is do a query, select the title, the target, and the actual fields from the sales list. It doesn't say from the sales list. That's going to happen in a second. And then order those results by title. So I take that query, I get my context, and I say I'm going to run this query against the sales data list with this new camel query. And what I want you to do for me, SharePoint, is give me back the items that are satisfied by the camel query, which is ultimately fulfilled by this view that I defined above. So at this point, I call execute query async, and that sends a web service call to the server. And when it succeeds, assuming it does, it executes the first function argument, which we have here. If it fails, it just shows an alert that says unable to get sales data. But this is some very simple JavaScript code. It adds a table to the page, and then it loops through the items that came back in the query, and for each one of the items it finds, it adds a table row with the item title, the target value, and the actual value. Now, to make this work on my host web, I have in my app a thing called a client web part feature. So if we take a look at it here in Sales View, here's the client web part, and it says the name of it is Sales View, the title is Current Sales, and the frame that's going to be produced is going to be by default 300 by 200. And that's up to me as the developer. And what I want the source of that iframe to be is inside the app web, the sales view page that we were just looking at, passing in the standard tokens. And in the case of the sales view page, it uses the standard tokens in order to establish the context. All right, so let's come up here to build and deploy this solution. And it goes through the in steps. It installs the app for SharePoint. And now it says deploy succeeded. So I'm going to go back to my developer site, and I'm going to edit the home page. All right, so I'll put the cursor right underneath the apps in testing list view and come up to insert. Now I can click either app part or web part in this case. If I choose web part, it appears under the parts apps category, and I know that this is my app because it's got the little boxy icon, but also because the title that I specified in my client web part was current sales. All right, so let's go ahead and select current sales and add it to my page. And just like that, we can see that the JavaScript is actually running. And that is how you make an app part. So this is a very good approach, like I said, for lightweight solutions where you have what would have been a traditional solution as a single web part. An app part in an app web may be an excellent way for you to go.